Yo, I'm Chucky Prophet. Welcome to The Oracle, the series where I'm just gonna discuss whatever I've watched recently, or read, and tell you if it's worth watching. Our first episode is about Towa No Quon, a show I'll bet you've never heard of, but you will probably recognize this fight. Well, it's at least been all over the anime portion of every social media site at least 5 times, accompanied by the words, "This shit heat," and at least 7 fire emojis. So, is it heat? Well, let us peer into my crystal ball, my friends, and discover. So what is this show even about? Well, basically, there's people with powers in this world. They're called attractors. Or lava, they change it around a lot, and these people have a wide range of powers that can mutate their body if not used properly. To keep them under control, a group called Custos uses cyborgs to fight and capture them. However, attractors are just sorta ordinary people, whose powers develop without warning, but Custos doesn't care about this because they are seen as disturbing greater social order. In order to protect these people then, the protagonist, Quon, has set up an organization that looks after these attractors and tells them how to use their powers. It's called Fantasium Garden. The entire story focuses around him basically trying to save young attractors from being killed or captured by Custos. And that's basically the CliffsNotes malversion. I won't go into spoilers yet, but while the overall idea of the show is well executed, the pacing is very wonky. This is because it's split into 6-hour-long movie episodes. Now, I know normal shows are generally split into hour-long episodes anyway, but it's different here because each of these movies is deliberately set up with its own theatrical release as an individual movie. Therefore, each one of these episodes has more of an onus on it to kind of have this overall plot that cleanly and clearly develops from start to finish. It has to be complete. This problem is particularly prevalent within the second episode, which really should have gone towards furthering the continuing story, but ends up just being a sort of side romp that doesn't really affect much except to develop a few characters. However, the world is still very fun despite this, and well explored, and despite the pacing issues, it's a pretty good story overall. That about wraps it up for the CliffsNotes on the story, so it's time to engage with some spoilies. Skip ahead if you want to watch it yourself. Now, if you're returning or just don't give a shit about spoilies, here we go. Let's start with the good. The first episode is real fucking good. In many ways, it's kind of the perfect first episode. It both acts as a really fun, self-contained story that introduces the characters and world, and as a microcosm of what the overall themes and ideas of the story are. These themes and ideas are then taken and kinda just gets weaker and weaker as the story goes on, with the major one just kinda disappearing at the story's climax. See, a central idea that the first episode presents is this intriguing ideological conflict between Quon and the leader of Custos, Kamishiro. See, Kamishiro in this first episode is presented as this cold, authoritative figure backed by a shadowy organization that runs the entire world, seeking to preserve societal order at any cost, an ideology that clashes beautifully with the protagonist Quon, as he wants to save everyone at any cost, regardless of the damage done to himself or potential damage to those around him. So we have a protagonist representing the idea that people should be protected no matter the cost to oneself, and a villain who will violate any human right and commit any act just to maintain a greater social order. This is an incredibly compelling duality, and I wish the story stuck with it. But in episode 5, it's revealed that Kamishiro, whilst claiming to loathe the attractors, was one himself the whole time, and actually doesn't give a shit about greater social order. It's a dumb twist with no lead up and is only really executed so that Quon can have a big epic fight scene at the end. It's a shame, as Kamishiro was previously one of the best characters in the entire thing, but after his reveal he kinda just has to become this boring, one-note, I love power villain that has no real thematic connection with the story or with the protagonist. I guess you could make the argument that it's a reflection of the hypocrisy and greed of those in power, but I feel that this theme could have explored far better and in a lot less cheap ways by just having him not be an attractor. However, a theme that is handled consistently well is the constant idea of transhumanism and the value of one's own humanity, a theme which is explored primarily through the cyborgs used by Custos and how they've carved away at their humanity willingly to hunt the attractors. Specifically, this theme is explored through the cyborg codenamed Epsilon, whose arc revolves around him realizing the attractors are people people too, and lamenting their decision to mechanize his body in order to hunt them down. We also see consistently that the Custos have completely dehumanized the androids, and see them merely as tools, best represented by the multiple mind wipes that are almost inflicted upon Epsilon, purely to increase his efficiency. Beyond the execution of his themes though, Towa No Quon suffers heavily due to its pacing, as I said before. Pacing enforced on it by the odd decision to have it be split up into 6-hour-long movies. This decision means that important reveals are often left to last minute and with little to no setup, because the earlier movies make no effort to provide it, because of the decision to have them constantly have these full arcs. Towards the end, the story also becomes a little predictable and relies heavily on MacGuffins that are introduced with little to no setup. For example, the existence of Quon's frigid little brother, who is currently trapped in a crystal. Towa, who has the strongest attractor power ever, must not fall into Kamishiro's hands. The use of these story elements is perfectly fine, it doesn't ruin the story and they are competently utilized. It's just a shame a story with such a promising start fell down so fast. Aside from the complaining though, this world is fundamentally a very interesting one, and the overall story is pretty damn competent. I just can't help wishing more was done with it, is all. As for the characters, Towa No Quon's protagonist Quon is pretty interesting. The first few episodes essentially revolve around his obsession with helping every character, and saving them from their various crises. However, this obsession is extremely self-destructive and leads to him taking on many physical and mental injuries throughout the course of the show. Eventually, his desperation to help as many people as possible leads to the destruction of his shelter for the Attractors, Fantasium Garden, which is a really solid character moment. His fundamental tragedy is very compelling, and as previously stated, contrasts beautifully with the cold, rational order enforced by Kamishiro and Custos. However, as good as his early characterization is, the rushed pacing of the latter episodes lead to many of his most important character moments feeling completely underwhelming. He just becomes the problem solver, and isn't really forced to make any real decision on whether or not he should continue a self-destructive path or not. Many characters face this kind of significant downturn in their writing quality towards the end. As I've already mentioned, this is particularly evident with the main villain, Kamishiro. Not just thematically, but in terms of his personality. He begins as this mysterious, arrogant, shit-eating asshole who's been sponsored by a shady government organization which is literally called Ordo to maintain the world's current order at the cost of the lives of the Attractors. And to achieve this end, he is allowed to do whatever he wants, even actively choosing to violate the Geneva Convention. He's mainly intriguing as a thematic opposite to Quon admittedly, but everyone loves a well-played shit-eating villain that inevitably gets his face smashed in. But that just sort of goes away when he's revealed to be an Attractor. He becomes this generic, me want power for power's sake because I am bad, boring bad guy with no actual thematic conflict or reason for fighting Quon. Now, it's not necessarily necessary to constantly have a beautifully contrasting thematic villain in every story you tell, but when you set one up, you kind of have a responsibility to pay one off, rather than just making him actively less interesting by the end. The only consistently well-executed character is Epsilon, an android recruited by Custos, who we discover was actually an Attractor during the events of episode 3, a discovery which creates a great deal of cool personal conflict for him, as he has come to realize the fact that Attractors are actually people, instead of potential threats to order. Through him, we also explore themes of transhumanism, as he has carved away large portions of his body and replaced them with cybernetic upgrades to fight Attractors more effectively. He's consistently treated as nothing but a tool by Custos, and through this we see how little the New World Order values people at an individual level, versus the greater societal order. In the end, he sacrifices himself to save the residents of Fantasium Garden, one of the few genuinely emotionally resonant moments in the series. However, despite the generally quite capable writing of most of the main cast, the side characters come off as extremely lackluster and direly needing further development. A prime example of this can be found in the character of Kiri, a mute girl whose powers allow her to heal through song, which, although not an entirely unique concept, is pretty interesting to explore. However, she largely stops being mute after the first episodes and completely fades into the background after the third for seemingly no reason, despite a lot of screen time being devoted to her in the early episodes, with the first episode being entirely centralized around her story, which would make one think, oh, this is going to be a main character running forward, but she isn't. Now, many of the members of Fantasium Garden also suffer this problem, and any interesting developments they do have are undercut by a lack of time taken to fully focus on them. For instance, there's this guy with a teleporting ability which breaks his legs every time he uses it because he hasn't fully trained with it. His arc is supposed to be about him coming to learn how to use his ability properly, but instead he is barely developed through background characterization and continues being useless until he eventually has a random unprecipitated change of heart and betrays the group, which he is actively never punished for. There are a few side characters which are serviceable, for instance the android Delta who complements Epsilon's story, but on the whole the sidecast is bland and unmemorable. Again, this is primarily a problem caused by poor pacing, particularly in the latter episodes. As for the visuals and audio, well, right off the bat, it's fucking Studio Bones, creators of such bangers as Mob Psycho, Soul Eater, and FMAP, so you know it's got an inherently extremely high proportion of things looking amazing, regardless of its actual quality as a series. And yeah, unsurprisingly, it does. It's not just that one funny scene that's animated beautifully, it's almost every fight. The culprit for this is, as a fair few people may have probably already guessed, Big Man himself, Yutaka Nakamura, well known for helping to create those Bones masterpieces I already mentioned earlier, using his signature style. Due to his influence and the skill of the entire animation team, most of the series fights, and particularly its transformations, look gorgeous. There are a handful of points of inconsistency. Some fight scenes are not quite up to the same standards as the funny scene, but are still regardless very enjoyable. On top of this, the fights that do look gorgeous do not last for very long, which is a shame, but it's more of a restriction because of the fight's pacing than a lack of emphasis placed on the animation itself. In terms of choreography, they're mostly just pretty simplistic, as powers in the show aren't particularly well defined, not even the main characters. So characters just kind of do big flashy cool moves and you go along with it, which is exactly what the series is going for, so that's fine, as these scenes are meant to be short and dramatic punctuations of emotional moments within the story. Although, what is a shame is that with this diverse cast of characters, we barely see any powers actually used offensively or used particularly creatively when they are used, which is a shame. It once again feels like an inability to maximize the potential for cool fights within this world setting. In terms of how the show looks in non-fight scenes, it is again pretty damn consistent. Bones is just a really fucking capable animation studio, and everything is capably directed. So yeah, it looks pretty damn solid. Additionally, the character designs are all pretty good, at least in terms of how they represent the characters themselves. However, equally there are none that stand out as particularly amazing or well put together, although there are some pretty creative monster designs for when the attractors allow their powers to run wild and mutate them. Sadly though, there are even a few stinkers mixed in here and there that either just look outright ridiculous or don't reflect a base human form well. As for Towa No Quon's score, similar to its fights, the tracks are predominantly pretty good. They're again best used to punctuate emotional or hype fight scenes, though only one or two stood out as particular bangers on a re-listen. As for voice acting performances, I can't really speak for the dub, but on the whole the sub is very competent and well casted, and in particular I'm a really big fan of the Kamishiro VA, as he beautifully captures the sliminess of characters like him. So, in conclusion, what is the Oracle's verdict? Well, as previously stated, if you've seen that one fight scene and immediately became interested in it, give it a watch. It's definitely got a lot more to offer in terms of beautifully put together fight animation. Outside of that, if you're dearly lacking something to watch in the hustle and bustle of constant seasonal shows, I'd recommend it. It's a decent dive into a fun, unique world. However, do just be aware that it falls off fairly significantly towards the end in my opinion, and the best episode is still the first. So it's very much a pick up the first episode and see how you feel kind of experience. My overall ranking is a B. It's a solidly fun time, worth picking up if you've got nothing else.